The term Zosterops comes from two classical Greek prefixes, zoster, meaning a belt or girdle, and opsis, meaning the eye. So the Zosterops birds have a ring belt around the eye. In Australia, there are two species that are commonly seen, and most of this video will be on what is called the Silvereye, or Zosterops lateralis. In the tropical north, there is the yellow white-eye, Zosterops luteus. The Australian Silvereye, Zosterops lateralis, is defined by firstly the white ring of minute feathers around the eye, a straight slender bill, and the colour variation is from olive green to yellow with pale unders and a rusty coloured buff on the side, which is subspecies dependent. The grey is usually in the form of a saddle extending from the nape over the back of the bird, while the yellow is found in varying degrees of intensity on the throat and vent of the bird. And the yellow, particularly on the throat, can vary according to season and subspecies. And subspecies variation has changed with time. Once there were 15 subspecies, but this has now been reduced to 9. Here from Matthew's books published in the early 1900s, an illustration of the variations of what he believed at that time were all Zosterops lateralis. The next plate is the different species that he thought existed at that time. These illustrations cover the same subspecies that we today recognise. In the genus Zosterops, there are approximately 100 species, all in the Indo-Pacific region. 6 Zosterops species have been found in Australia, but only 2 of these are common, the Silvereye and the yellow white-eye as previously shown. And today our focus is on the Silvereye, or Zosterops lateralis. The greater majority of Silvereyes have the grey and olive complex, and this is also a feature of the Australian Silvereye. In the continental Australian Silvereye, there are variations in colour, going from east to west and south to north, giving rise to multiple subspecies. The total number of subspecies can vary between ornithologists, but on continental Australia it is generally considered that these variations in colour result in 6 mainland subspecies. The nominate subspecies is often referred to as the Tasmanian Silvereye, for it breeds in the southern latitudes, particularly Tasmania, then escaping Tasmania in winter, migrates north. So the trinomial name is Zosterops lateralis lateralis, and is characterised by the greenish-yellow colours of the head and the back. A grey saddle from the nape going onto the back augments the darker colours on the back. In contrast, the chest and the belly are pale, and the throat is a very pale grey, and the flanks are coloured with a cinnamon buff. In wintertime, if we move further north along the east coast of continental Australia, the Silvereyes have less buff on the sides, and the throat, though still pale, has a yellowish tinge. And now a new subspecies is named, and it is called westernensis. With a flock of birds like this, one always likes to see them coming in virtually cloned, in other words, all having the same appearance. However, when there's variation, one is always uncertain. whether it is other members of a different subspecies coming in and joining that particular group. And westernensis, like all other silvereyes, loves to eat pollen, nectar, fruit, and most of all, insects. The previous map showed westernensis going from Victoria into southern New South Wales. However, this range is overlapped enormously by the southern and the northern birds. And on sites like iNaturalist, where people submit the photos and their geolocation, it is often hard to find a westernensis because of this overlap. There is one other problem with westernensis. It's one of the birds that may not reveal any buff on the sides like the one shown here, and then confusion with the lateralis. But it is rare for the lateralis not to have buff on the side, so a pale throat on a grey-sided bird is usually westernensis. Here now we are in northern New South Wales, and look at the beautiful golden throat on this bird. A little bit of buff on the side, but certainly the buff intensity is reduced. This is the Cornwallis subspecies. But just to make things more confusing, sometimes the Cornwallis, like here, photographed more inland on the central tablelands of New South Wales, has a very prominent buff on the side, so it's not always a reducing buff as one travels further north. Another factor with the intensity of the cinnamon buff on the flank of the bird is breeding mode. If they are in breeding mode, the saturation on the flank may be increased. Here now, at the northern tablelands, is the characteristic Cornwallis with the pale buff on the side. Throughout this video, I will place subtitles showing what particular subspecies I believe this silvereye is. Now, as mentioned, because they don't have definitive geographic areas and they are very migratory, I am not always correct. So if you believe that there is one particular bird that is a different subspecies, you may well be correct, and I will elaborate on this more at the end of the video. A flock of silvereyes drinking. Silvereyes are flock birds, coming together to feed and drink as flocks. And to get large numbers like this, it tells us that migration is happening. Normally at this site I would only get 1 or 2 birds at the water point. Within this group there are subtle variations, but the greater majority of the birds look like Cornwallis. Some have a minor degree of grey on the throat instead of yellow. And Cornwallis, like all the other silvereyes, glean through the trees and shrubs, mostly spending time on the ground. But most importantly, they can be found amongst flowers, for there the insects are, and the nectar can also be found. During breeding in spring and summer, silvereyes are in bonded pairs more than flocks. But in the non-breeding mode, they come and feed together and drink together, and you can see here the silvereyes feeding on the bottle brush. The silvereye is omnivorous, but getting a large amount of its food and calorie intake from flowers feeding on nectar, it does tend to follow the flowers. Firstly, for the nectar and pollen, and secondly, flowers attract insects. Silvereyes are nomadic birds, and the nominate subspecies is migratory, breeding in Tasmania. Then as winter approaches, it flies north, crossing the Bass Strait to mainland Australia, and then moves along the east coast. Here at Swansea Heads in central New South Wales on the coast, the migrating silvereyes stop to feed but were chased away by the wattle birds. As the silvereye Zosterops migrate north, they constantly land and feed, and this chatter is very attractive to the honeyeaters. The honeyeaters aren't so much of a group bird as the silvereyes, and as they listen to the chatter, they also think they must be finding nectar, and they follow. Some of the honeyeaters, in particular the yellow-faced and the white-naped honeyeaters, follow the silvereyes. The silvereyes are the initiators of this migration, and both birds seem to have a geomagnetic compass that tells them to move north in autumn. This migration is a fantastic thing to see. Several thousand birds per hour can be seen heading north. The honeyeaters seem very frenzied as they do this migration, only stopping for extremely short intervals. In contrast, the silvereyes seem to have more stops, feeding as they go north. And a good way to find out what birds are migrating is to observe at water points along the migratory pathway. Previously the water points were close to the coast, but here we are up on the divide, several hundred kilometres inland. And you can see the silvereyes in combination with the white-naped honeyeaters and the yellow-faced honeyeaters. And it's this trio that forms the large migration heading to northern latitudes. And though all the silvereyes do a migration, it's the Tasmanian subspecies, the Lateralis lateralis, that does the most extensive migration, spreading themselves from Tasmania to beyond the Queensland border. The same trio of birds at another water point on the divide. This frenzied flight requires a quick stop and a drink. It seems that all the silvereyes undergo a latitudinal shift as winter comes along, presumably directed at finding blossom. And here is a Tasmanian Zosterops silvereye feeding at Maitland in New South Wales on Melaleuca blossom. A very grey saddle on this silvereye, and again it's looking at blossom to feed on the nectar. No rusty blush on the flanks, just a grey colour. This silvereye is of the subspecies westernensis. Now we need to look at the variations that happen within an area. Generally, subspecies are defined by geographic areas, but just watch these birds all filmed up in northern New South Wales, and you can see the variation amongst them. In spring and summer, the silvereyes go around in either pairs or very small groups, for they are in nurturing and breeding mode. By now you may be confused with the subspecies variations, but here is a classical nominate subspecies. The bird comes from Tasmania as previously mentioned, but saying that, this bird was photographed in winter as a single bird in New South Wales. And again another shot of another single bird, so they don't all flock, and this is because they don't all migrate. Some of these birds are local residents. Back to the flocking associated with the migration, where you get massive numbers of birds like this coming in at water points. A group of silvereyes will constantly chatter. They chatter not only at water points, but also when they are feeding. And it's this group behaviour that allows them to find food more effectively than the honeyeaters. And so with the migration, as the nominate species moves from Tasmania north, so it is most likely that the honeyeaters follow. Look at this silvereye on the left. It is different than the other silvereyes, for it has less cinnamon buff on the flank. So at this point one begins to wonder exactly the variations that we find within the subspecies. Do they reflect different degrees of migration? Or is it seasonal, molting, a sex difference, subspecies interbreeding? We do not know the answers. And the traditional concept of a geographically isolated subspecies is shrouded in the silvereye because of the migratory overlap of each of the subspecies. The silvereyes are beautiful little birds, and irrespective of the subspecies, are always a delight to watch as they come in to drink at a water point. Let's get back to the classical nominate species, and you can see this bird looks very grey as it goes around amongst the flowers gleaning insects and going into the flowers to see if there's any nectar. This is the nominate subspecies Lateralis lateralis. Hear that chatter of the birds as they feed? This is what the honeyeaters want to hear, and this is why the honeyeaters will follow them as they head north. Look at the beautiful buff on the side of this bird, a definite Tasmanian subspecies. Silvereyes and honeyeaters both have feathered tongues, both have a similar feeding pattern, largely relying on nectar. Here in northern New South Wales, two young immature birds, probably Cornwallie. But note the white eye band around the eye. It is very narrow. This suggests immaturity. And this white eye band is interesting, for if you do DNA studies, you'll find that the most closely related honeyeater to the silvereye belong to the genus Melithreptus. And Melithreptus have a bare area around the eye. But the interesting thing with the mass migration of the silvereyes is that one of the Melithreptors accompanies them. This is the white-naped honeyeater, and to a lesser extent the brown-headed honeyeater. This little silvereye dancing around this water point is a cornwallie. A little bit of buff on the sides, yellow under the chin. Determined to get a drink, and yet wanting also to have a bath. Now here we are in tropical North Queensland, and the silvereye has a nice goldy colour to the head, and beyond the shadow the vent of this bird is yellow. This North Queensland silvereye is the Vegetus subspecies. Look at this one as it feeds from the grasshead flower. Watch the rump. It is yellow. The West Australian subspecies Chloronotus also has a yellow vent like this. The other feature with the silvereye in Western Australia is that the saddle is more green than grey. The flanks of the West Australian bird are also more grey, lacking the cinnamon buff. And just like the buff reduces going from south to north, so the flank buff also reduces going from east to west. To conclude, talking more about variations, I will show 3 clips taken of 3 different birds feeding in the same melaleuca at the same time in Maitland, New South Wales. All in a melaleuca. This first one looks very much like a westernensis, with a pale throat and light cinnamon buff, seen as it takes off. The second bird has a deeper flank buff, and as it turns its head, notice that it has yellow under the chin. And then finally, look at this one. Real strong buff on the side. You would think it was definitely a Tasmanian one, but now with an extremely bright yellow throat. Probably all cornwallie, but with variations. So in conclusion, I would suggest, particularly in New South Wales, don't be dogmatic about the subspecies identification, as that it's very difficult. You will get some idea, but when you see these variations with age, sex, molting, post-molting colour, migration and breeding between the subspecies, I believe there is still a lot to learn. On behalf of Plumes of Oz, thank you for watching this video on the silvereye. If you would like to get notifications of further birds in the wild in Australia, simply hit the subscribe button.